We are going to go up to our neighbors in the north, Canada. Wyatt, you're up with Janelle.
Awesome, thank you. Well, Janelle, I learned so much from what you said already, and Scott asked some great questions that brought this one up for me. And I'll just start it with what I'm having difficulty with, which is what level of honesty I should have with my employees, what level of vulnerability I should have with them about two things: my personal growth and the vulnerabilities of our organization. And the way I kind of want to ask it is a percentage case. Is it 100% vulnerability? Tell them everything you can, let them know exactly what's going on, or like 50%, and I want it from your experience, from you being a leader and having good leaders. What have you found is the most effective way to lead an organization with that kind of vulnerability?
Well, hi, Wyatt. That's a great question. I will say I'm going to lead it with a vague answer, but I'll get more specific. It depends, because I would say you have to be authentic to yourself, right? So if I were to tell you, you have to be 100% vulnerable, and that is 100% out of your comfort zone, then you're constantly going to be second guessing and questioning everything you do as a leader. Like, am I being 100% vulnerable? Am I not? Like, is this the moment where I am? And that's honestly too much work, right? Like, it is too much work for you to think, as your days roll by as a leader, what type of vulnerability to demonstrate in each different scenario, right? Like, you're going to spend so much time thinking about it, you're not actually going to be an effective leader. So that's why I start off by saying it depends. And by stepping back and understanding like your authentic self of like what looks right for you, because that's what we know about high performers, is that there's this alignment where, like, when you're on and you feel really good because you're being authentic and demonstrating, right, like your high performance skills in those moments. But when it feels awkward, right, then you're kind of like in this off, like that this is not the right path. So there should be some vulnerability, and I think a lot of leaders shy away from that. And so maybe for some of us, we have to work on it a little bit, because we tend to not be vulnerable at all. So that's why I would say for that person, it may be huge to open up some vulnerability at like a 10% level. But for someone like me, I have found that authentically, true to myself and my leadership is, we had an airman die when I was a squadron commander. He actually drank himself to death, facing some major adversity. And the talking point in my head was, be strong, like, don't show emotion, like, just support your team. And as I was telling his friends, and they're crumpling on the floor in the moment, like, my authentic self wanted to be there on the floor with them, right? And like say, yeah, like, I'm going to sit here with you in this moment of sadness, and I'm going to demonstrate that, like, what's true to me is to be sad and show that vulnerability, even though the talking point in my head said do everything you can not to be. So that's the fight, right? If we're talking and fighting the rules inside our head, it's going to be very difficult to be as authentic. So that's kind of the first part of the answer, right? Like, figure out, like, and it takes some work to really figure out like what is true to you by really knowing yourself and exploring that. And then the second space, I think what you're getting after as well is this idea of failure, which can be very hard for leaders. I like to think of failure as this idea of failing forward. Like, there's nothing wrong with failure as long as you're moving forward from it, and there's a lesson to be learned. If you sit in failure, like as a leader or as an organization, you're going to really struggle. Mm-hmm. But if you use it as like a data point, right? Okay, that didn't work, right? Like, how can we pivot? How can we like take this information and build it into something that moves us forward? And I think the fear of failure is very prevalent in a lot of leaders. And as soon as you can kind of clear that noise out of your head, it will also open up space for you to be vulnerable and authentic. I hope that helps.
That does help a lot. What you said about just framing it in a way that moves us forward, at least in some direction, is the perfect way to put it, because it doesn't have to, not everything has to be done perfectly, but as long as it's moving us a step forward, even if it's from a failure. That's the only thing that matters. So that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And Scott, you alluded to something in one of the earlier questions about like our culture today and,
Yeah.
not taking as many risks. One tool that I used as a leader, I called it No Email Friday. And what it meant was most of Friday, I was out and about with the people I worked with, right? Like learning more about them,
Yep.
like connecting with them, no meetings, no emails on Friday. And I expected all my subordinate leaders to do the same. But you know what I noticed, the backside of that is that it was an empowerment tool because people didn't want to bother me on Fridays to ask me right on email, like, hey, how should we answer this? Or, hey, I'm informing you of that. They just had to make their own decisions. And empowerment, right, and allowing people to do those mistakes and not catch them all the time, is how you develop a culture that sees failure differently. Now, the trick is, you can't on Monday morning as the leader be like, oh, you guys all messed that up last week when you didn't ask my permission or you didn't fill me in. No, instead you say, okay, like, did we do that exactly like we wanted to? No, but what did we learn, right? And then you use it as a teaching moment or a learning moment. And then that creates this culture around failing forward, empowerment, and risk-taking.